What's up, guys? Welcome to Roensch Capital Charts. Today we're taking a look at Palantir stock, ticker symbol PLTR, on a variety of time frames in anticipation of the next trading day, Friday, May 24th. Alright guys, Palantir stock here today down 45 cents per share. That's minus 2.13% in regular trading hours. Let's take a look at this name and try to get the absolute best feel we can for Palantir heading into tomorrow. We're going to, of course, take a look at the volume profile to pull out directional bias from that. We'll look at the psychological levels. As always, big money's watching them, so we're going to have to pay attention to those as well. Implied volatility, the expected move for tomorrow, and the directional bias coming out of the chain for tomorrow. Now, of course, we had that big sell-off off the open this morning, so let's get started by doing our volume profile analysis on the 5-minute and see if there's any underlying directional bias when we take a peek under the hood. Bears. It's a 2.1% green day with a couple of big sell-offs here during the day, so you guys are going to want to see some undeniable bearish bias in the volume profile. Bulls, ideally we would really see no bias whatsoever. That would show us that there's really no supporting bias in the underlying move, which is, you know, after the movement has already occurred, it's down 2.1%, that's said and done. Ideally, there wouldn't be much bias to support that if you are a bull. So let's take a peek. First of all, by the way, guys, Palantir's a daily upload, so I appreciate you subscribing to the channel. My goal here is 10,000, and we can't do it without your help. So I appreciate it. Now, let's take a look. Immediately off the rip here, off the open. This is pretty clear, guys. Typically, where we see a very quick fade in volume, like if you look at my mouse, it would typically follow a look like this. This here would typically be chopped off. It held on during pretty much the entirety of that downside move. That is pretty undeniable bearish bias. Okay? Again, if we don't remain unbiased, what are we really doing here? Let's move through the day. Listen, it's much smaller than the bearish bias that we just talked about, but this here, you see a bit of a pop in volume, and it is relatively sustained. That's a small amount, a much smaller amount, but it's a small amount of bullish bias on that little bounce that we got up out of the hole. So that is there as well. Doesn't quite offset the bearish bias that we saw off the open. And then as we move through the day, this is, again, very small, but we're seeing a little bit of inconsistent pops, but there's enough of them with few enough bullish bars, right, and it's low enough volume, that I'm also going to go ahead and assign a little bit of bearish bias there. Okay, arguably similar to what we saw back here. We're seeing higher volume, but the downfall of the bearish side back here, in kind of like the mid-afternoon, mid to late afternoon, at least in New York, we're seeing higher volume on average, whereas over here on the bullish volume is a little bit more consistent. I would say those two kind of offset each other. The close is rather contextual, leaving us with just that bearish bias off the open. All right, now let's move on to something arguably a lot more simple, but also very, very effective. The psychological self-fulfilling prophecy levels, that there's going to be a lot of trading decisions made around if we see tests. Now, you guys remember last night, we were talking a lot about how we had given up, or we were still below, I should say, both the 50 period, that white line, and the 200 period here on the 30-minute chart. We attempted to reclaim both actually overnight, and then this morning off the open, we tested the 200 period and quickly rejected hard on that high volume open, downside through the 50 period, giving it up. That, as a result, is beginning to drag the 50 period down, which, if you're a bear, that could be seen as a positive as long as the stock continues to reject the 50 period off of any retest. But bulls, this is actually a little up in the air because the stock as of right now is less than 2%. It's about 1.74% away from that 50 period. If we get a retest as it comes down, which is likely that percentage move necessary to retest it is likely to be smaller by tomorrow as the 50 period comes down even lower. But bulls, if we can get a retest of that level, the 50 period being lower allows for, again, a smaller move necessary to make the retest. And if we can rip through, that would mean we could reclaim that level as short-term support even sooner. However, the negative side of that comes if the 50 period is dropping and the bears are able to reject off of it as descending resistance. okay, which is obviously what the bears would want. Bulls, we want to reclaim that as soon as we can. Let's move on here to the 4-hour chart. You can see, as of yesterday, the 4-hour was very in play. As of now, we're about 2.75% away from a retest of the 50 period on the 4-hour chart. Listen, bulls, it's within reason. We've seen crazier things on Palantir in a single day, but it would take likely at least a 3% move to reclaim that. But just understand that here on the 4-hour in particular, that's really my primary concern, is reclaiming that 50 period as soon as we can, because it's the most commonly watched indicator on this chart. I would argue by far by the most amount of eyeballs. Bears, just getting that 50 period to start descending, because, you know, it's the 4-hour, it's going to move a little bit slower, right, the 50 period. But if you could start to see that 50 period descend, okay, that's a move in the right direction if you are a bear. And then, of course, any retest, you'd want to see it reject and maintain as resistance. Now, the most important chart of all is going to be the daily. This is a pretty clear story here. As of late on Palantir, we've been talking a ton about the 21 to 22 whole dollar channel. That broke today. Bears, that was a victory for you guys here today. Bulls, not ideal to break downside below 21. However, we have a couple of things left over. We know that 2050 is historically, at least in the last, let's say, month or so, it's a psychological and technical level, right? They tend to become each other. It kind of started off as technical. It's starting to turn slightly more psychological. 2050 is the ideal hold to help push us back above 21 here tomorrow if we're bulls. Okay, bears, ideally, break downside beneath 2050, and you're about a 3.5% move to the downside away from 20 bucks a share. Bears, if you could claim 20 as a resistance level here in the next couple of days, I mean, that would be a major, major win. Bulls, how do we ward that off? Hold 2050, bounce up back above 21, and reclaim that channel from 21 to 22 to start giving us a shot back upside at that $22 area we've been struggling with so much the last week or two. Now, implied volatility, very important for those of you trading options. Compared to the last week, it's very low. Or it's a bit low, let's say. Okay, compared to the last month, it's very low. And compared to the last 3 months, it's low. All right? So basically, no matter what time frame you look at it, at least week, month, 3 months, it's in the lower range. All right, so the Vega value being priced into the options right now is going to be quite low, at least with that intended trade time frame, up to about 3 months. So listen, if you have a strong directional bias, perhaps not the worst time to think about buying some contracts while Vega is very low. But again, of course, you still have to be directionally correct. But having IV being so low, you're not paying up front for that Vega value. And if it turns around, then you might experience some IV pump, along with also the delta pump that comes with being directionally correct. So you have kind of a double whammy in your favor in that scenario. Now, the expected move for tomorrow here. Thursdays are easy because we have an expiration tomorrow, May 24th. The expected move by tomorrow's close compared to today's close is plus or minus 48 to 49 cents per share. That's the one standard deviation expected move, the expected volatility range being priced in by the market here tomorrow. Of course, important to know, especially if you're trading options. And if you disagree with that, along with a directional bias that you may have, that's a good thing that you disagree, right? Because that could be a potential position for you. And now, the directional bias coming out of the chain. About 320,000 total contracts traded today. 244,000 of them were calls and 76,000 were puts. Pretty heavy call side bias on the overall ratio. And let's look down here. Volume gets a little lower, take it with a grain of salt, but the 0 to 20 delta range, those are those short-term speculators. We're seeing quite the heavy call side bias. 104,000 calls, 21,000 puts out of the short-term speculators here today. Listen, guys, if you appreciate the daily Palantir videos, please, the best thing you can do for the channel is leave a like on the video. Helps out tremendously. I appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one.